Okay, gang, here goes your end of the year review for Unit 4 for APUSH. Excuse me, I have stuffed up nose here with allergies. I apologize for that, but we carry on. I'm looking at the review book here. Question 1 is an interesting question. It's asking whether the Jeffersonian Republicans who claim to believe in small government and strict construction of the Constitution were really as for small government as they say they were once they got in power. And they're asking you the same question about the Federalists. When they were out of power, were they consistent with their belief that government should be active, that there should be a broad construction of the Constitution? Remember, I'm looking now at the review sheet, so I'm going to sort of read through the question, putting the answers in your blanks as I go along here. Strict construction taught that the Constitution should be followed strictly and that government should be small and limited. Broad or loose constructionism taught that the Constitution should be flexible and liberally interpreted to do what was necessary and proper. And that's the elastic clause. Jefferson was the most famous strict constructionist, and his party were the Republicans, and the Federalist Party was the party of loose constructionists. And their primary advocate was Alexander Hamilton. Now, in practice here, Jefferson, to avoid war with France and Britain when he was president, issued a trade embargo, stopping trade by American shippers with all nations. Later, he embargoed only trade against France and Britain in the Non-Intercourse Act. Where does it say that he can do this in the Constitution? Nowhere. So he's violating his belief in small government by doing something which is a huge expansion of government power, shutting down international shipping. This is a big government thing to do, not in the Constitution. Jefferson also bought Louisiana from France in 1803, another action not approved in the Constitution. The Federalists, during the War of 1812, they're originally a party of big government. They will meet in Hartford, Connecticut to discuss secession. They oppose the war. They refuse to send militia, and they refuse to stop trading with England. So they are objecting to this war that's hurting trade, even though this war is democratically passed in the Congress. So these parties are inconsistent. Kind of a complex question at the time. This was a DPQ when they gave it. Question 2. To what extent and what ways did the roles of women change in American society between 1790 and 1860? Well, domestically, as middle-class men left the home to go to work, in factories there arose a cult of true womanhood, or also called the cult of domesticity. The idea here is that women were to stay at home and nurture children and provide moral training for little ones. The home became a safe haven for the family, a world apart from the workplace. As far as economic, and you've got these choices here. The first one was domestic, the next one's economic. Textile mills in Lowell hired farm girls to work. These girls were compliant, and now it says on the review sheet, I misspelled that complaint, not complaint, but compliant. They were compliant, they worked cheaply, they were happy to leave the boring life on the farm. Increasingly, there became a divide between middle-class women who tended the home and working-class women who were often poor and poor immigrants. As far as political, the 1844 Seneca Falls Convention demanded enfranchisement, or the franchise, the right to vote, but nowhere did women vote. Women had few rights concerning divorce, child custody, property ownership once married. In reality, many women did assist their husbands and worked on farms, worked in shops, helped their husbands with whatever the business was in reality, even though they did not have legal rights. Social, women were greatly involved in reform and in religion. Dorothea Dix, remember, helped the mentally handicapped get into insane asylums, safe places away from prisons and jails where they had been tossed. The Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, these are Southern Carolinians, opposed slavery, and Lee led the Shakers, this kind of religious cult that advocated communal living and celibacy. Harriet Tubman led slaves out of slavery, and Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton worked for women's rights. So women are very active in the social sphere. Question 3. Evaluate the relative importance of domestic and foreign policy in shaping American politics in the 1790s. This is kind of a tough question. Foreign policy, they're not asking about the Revolution, which at this point you should know something about. They're not asking about the War of 1812, which is a more remembered event. They're asking about these treaties, really, that are signed under Washington during his two terms. Jay's Treaty in 1794 was when Britain agreed to leave her forts in the West. And these are forts that should have been left much earlier, but this is in some ways kind of embarrassing for the U.S. to be sort of asking Britain to do what they already should do. But the big picture here is peace is maintained with Great Britain for quite a while. Treaty of Greenville in 1795, several Indian tribes ceded land in the Ohio area after their defeat at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and the guy who beats them here is General Anthony Wayne. The Treaty of San Lorenzo, also called Pinckney's Treaty, in 1795, Spain agreed to allow Americans the right of deposit at New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Remember, Spain at this point owns New Orleans, and they've been blocking our trade. All these farmers who are shipping their stuff down all these western rivers that empty into the Mississippi, and the Spanish, to sort of keep peace with us, agreed to allow us to drop our stuff off and ship it from their port. George Washington declares neutrality regarding European wars. France had demanded we honor our allegiance with them. Remember, they helped us after the Battle of Saratoga, and the French were instrumental during the Revolution. So these are some treaties you should know. Jay's Treaty, Pinckney's Treaty, Treaty of Greenville, and the Declaration of the Proclamation of Neutrality, once France gets involved in this long war during their revolution, in particular with the British. Question 4. Talk about how the original question was how two of the following influenced the development of American society. So there's three things we'll be looking at, and these three things are all religious events. First one is Puritanism. We already talked about this in Unit 1. Puritans settled Massachusetts. They set up a society based upon the Bible. They built schools to teach literacy and founded our first seminary to train preachers, Harvard, which became our first university. The Puritans hoped to make their community a city on a hill, a reference by John Winthrop to a society with morality, justice, and Christian faith. The Mayflower Compact was an early commitment to a participatory government. Settlers who left Massachusetts for Connecticut believed all free white men were equal and could vote, and this is seen in the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Roger Williams left the Puritans for Rhode Island and set up a colony with separation of church and state. The Great Awakening, a different event later on. This was a rebellion against state churches, which was not only a demand for religious freedom, but also for political freedom. The Great Awakening created a vocabulary of freedom, liberty, and tyranny. In setting up their own churches, Americans implicitly acknowledged the equality of all men and their right to self-govern, at least religiously. These ideas led to and supported the Revolutionary War, which came several decades later. And finally, the Second Great Awakening. Now, this is after the American Revolution. This is in the early 1800s. Charles Finney was one of the many preachers leading another religious revival. This awakening said men could choose salvation. This differed from the Calvinist idea of predestination of the earlier awakening. If men could choose God, then it followed they could choose moral reform. This era of the Second Great Awakening saw reforms like temperance, abolitionism, women's rights, or an attempt for women's rights, and the reform for the handicapped, prison reform, public schools, and various millennial religious groups. Asylum for the Handicapped is associated with Dorothea Dix. Women's rights, some names: Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Abolitionism: Frederick Douglass, runaway black slave who led abolition, the movement in the North, and William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist, the author of the Liberator newspaper, provocative journal. Temperance will evolve into prohibitionism and will lead to the first state prohibition in Maine, and states that copied Maine, these are called Maine laws. Public schools, Horace Mann, the purpose here is largely to assimilate immigrant kids, to turn them into good, patriotic Protestant Americans. Prison reforms, you have these terms reformatories and penitentiaries. The idea is rehabilitation and moral restoration. New York utopian communes, Oneida and Brooks Farm are two that you should know. The Shakers, leader is Ann Lee. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you have Joseph Smith, who's the original leader after he's martyred. Brigham Young leads the Mormons on the Great Trek to Safe Haven in Utah. And William Miller was the leader of the Millerites, and he's one of these guys that predicted that Jesus was going to come back in 1845. And you get this belief in millennialism, that is the imminent return of Jesus Christ. Question 5 asks, it's transportation improvements rather than manufacturing or agriculture that sparked economic growth in the first half of the 1800s. That's the first half of the 19th century. And of course, when you look at this question, this doesn't mean you're supposed to ignore manufacturing and agriculture and just talk about transportation. You're supposed to talk about all three things. So for manufacturing, you should talk about the cotton gin and interchangeable parts with Eli Whitney. You should talk about the first textile mill built by Sam Slater. You should talk about textile mills using young women, such as the Lowell girls. And you should talk about the growing coastal cities that are absorbing newcomers, immigrants that are working in these growing coastal industries. Agriculture, you can talk about the cotton gin, which causes slavery to expand deep into the interior of the U.S. 1843, John Deere invents the steel plow. 1834, Cyrus McCormick invents the mechanical reaper. As far as transportation, you have the building of toll roads. You have a national road, which is going to be leaving Maryland and going into the interior. You have canals, for example, the Erie Canal connecting the Great Lakes with New York City. You also have the development of steamboats, opening the shallow western rivers to increase trade and communication. And you have the early trains growing, the train system growing particularly in the North and in the Midwest in the decades preceding the Civil War. Question 6, discuss the impact of territorial expansion on national unity between 1800 and 1850. Well, the Compromise of 1820 sees the potential to upset the balance between slave and free states in the U.S. Senate, and the solution here is that Missouri will enter slave and Maine will enter free, and the 3630 line will divide the South from the North. The line below 3630 will be slave, and this is in that territory which is purchased by Jefferson from France in 1803. The failed Talmadge Amendment would have freed all the children of slaves in Missouri. This does not pass, but it's showing this growing sectionalism, this difference over slavery between the North and the South. And a Northerner would even propose such a radical idea to Southerners that the children of slaves should be free. Mexican-American War, the issue arose what to do with the new territory after Mexico ceded the Southwest in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This will lead to the Compromise of 1850, not to be confused with the Compromise of 1820. That refers to Missouri entering the Union. The Compromise of 1851 said no slave trade, not slavery, but no slave trade in D.C. 2, free statehood for California. 3, popular sovereignty in the rest of the Southwest. That's where the population decides on slavery. 4, a strict new Fugitive Slave Act. You could actually toss a fifth compromise in here, and that is the border is between Texas and New Mexico is done in a way that does not favor Texas. Texas is a slave state, and they're not going to get to be a bigger slave state. They're going to get some money payment here to allow the New Mexico territory basically to be intact for the most immediate years here. Did I just tell you 4? 4 is a new Fugitive Slave Act where the federal government will actively help hunt down slaves who have fled into the North, where previously they'd been finding safe haven. And this will lead to personal liberty laws in much of the North saying they will not comply with the Fugitive Slave Act. Next act you should know, 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned the Missouri Compromise. Remember, the Missouri Compromise said you couldn't have slavery north of 3630. And the withdrawal, the overturning of this in the Kansas-Nebraska Act will allow popular sovereignty to move into the North and theoretically slavery to move into the North. And this will lead to fighting in Kansas, kind of a preview, an omen of the Civil War, where 2 state governments will be declared, a free capital in Topeka and a slave capital in Lecompton. Enslavers famously will burn Lawrence to the ground, and John Brown will head into Kansas, and he'll kill a bunch of slavers at the Potawatomi Creek Massacre, and things are just really bad here in Kansas. Now note, this is 1854. The question asked only up to 1850, but the AP will allow you to bridge the question if you can connect this to the earlier compromises. And finally, the Dred Scott case of 1857 overturned all compromises that restricted the movement of slavery anywhere as a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which says that you can your property can't be taken from you without just compensation. Question 7. From 1755 to 1730, many African Americans gained their freedom from slavery, yet during the same period, the institution of slavery expanded as well. So you're getting more slaves and more freed slaves. So how do you explain this? And what are the slaves doing? What are the free blacks doing? This is one of the more complex DBQs when it was given a few years ago. As far as the growth of slavery, remember the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution specifically protects slavery. Slaves are counted as a portion of a white person for purposes of representation. International slave trade was protected for 20 years until 1808. This is in the Constitution. And runaway slaves, nicknamed fugitives in the Constitution, must be returned upon the request of one state to another. Remember Eli Whitney's cotton gin will make cotton profitable, and there'll be a great demand for slaves in the South. 90% of slaves lived in the Chesapeake region or in the lower South at the time of the American Revolution. And King Cotton is this idea that the world's economy really, or the Western world's economy, really depends on cotton, and that Southern slavery is sort of invulnerable, sort of bulletproof. The Brits, the Northerners, really depend upon this. And several million, arguably, Brits their textile industry depended upon cotton, and this dependence is causing a growth of slavery. The Missouri Compromise allows slavery to spread west. The Talmadge Amendment to end enslavement in Missouri and to free slaves at age 25 fails. And slave codes do limit slave behavior and movement of slaves. Growth of free blacks. Well, some are freed. Some of the things that lead to freeing of slaves, the Declaration of Independence, spurs many northern states will, within a decade or so after the Revolution, will all manumit or will have a process of a gradual abolition. And that's largely due to beliefs of Enlightenment ideas of human freedom. The Second Great Awakening will promote abolitionism as a Christian reform movement. You have black participation in Washington's army and promises of freedom. It's been pointed out, perhaps up to a fifth of his army were blacks. Also, the promises on the other side, Lord Dunmore of Virginia, a British governor, promises blacks freedom if they'll fight for the British Army. The Northwest Ordinance abolished slavery in the Northwest, and that would be north of the Ohio River. This would be Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. Slavery from the ground, from ground zero here, or from the foundation of these territories is prohibited. And the abolition, finally, of the international slave trade after the 20 years it had been protected. There are attempted slave rebellions. Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey are conspirators who are discovered, and some free states are going to disenfranchise free blacks. Free blacks do set up their own churches. Richard Allen sets up the African Methodist Episcopal Church, nicknamed the AME. And in 1816, the American Colonization Society begins the settlement of 15,000 slaves over 40 years in Africa's Liberia, which essentially is an American colony. Some slaves do run away to the north, and some run away to Spanish Florida, and some, after the Fugitive Slave Act, will go all the way to Canada to make sure they are not repatriated to the south. In this question, the Underground Railroad is not supposed to be used because that is more the 1850s to 1860. The question is only asking to 1830. And Harriet Tubman is also outside of the time frame of this question, as is Nat Turner's Rebellion. Also, you're not supposed to use William Lloyd Garrison. This is kind of fussy. I would say go ahead and use them, but use other things as well. You won't get marked off for using something out of the time period, and to use it does show knowledge, and if you can weave it into a coherent essay that includes lots of data, lots of content from the period, you will be all right. And I believe there was one more, maybe two more questions here. Question 10. Question 10. George Washington, let's see, the question is, analyze ways in which the U.S. sought to advance its interests in world affairs between 1789 and 1823. So I'll kind of bullet point through these for you. Washington's proclamation of neutrality kept us out of war between France and England. Hamilton promoted native industry through a tariff on foreign goods entering the U.S. Washington ordered the expulsion of Citizen Genet, who was agitating for war against France. Tension with Britain was reduced by Jay's Treaty. Access to New Orleans via the Mississippi River occurred with the Pinckney's Treaty, also called the Treaty of San Lorenzo. Remember, there's an English and an American and a Spanish name. And Washington's farewell address said to stay out of foreign affairs, out of foreign entanglements, foreign wars. John Adams. The U.S. fought a naval war against France and was angered by the XYZ affair. This led to an increase in naval building. Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which suppressed the Federalist Party, and the point here was to suppress anyone who would try to get us into war on the side of France. Correction here. Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which suppressed the Republican Party. That's the party. The Republican Party is the party that supports France. Major correction there. Thomas Jefferson purchased Louisiana territory from Napoleon. He kept neutrality during these continued wars between France and the rest of Europe in the Napoleonic era. Jefferson passes an Embargo Act, which banned foreign trade to keep us out of war. When the Brits, are picking off our sailors, and the French and the Brits are interfering with our ships. And the Embargo Act is followed by the Non-Intercourse Act. Jefferson does send our Navy to protect American ships in the Mediterranean against the Barbary pirates. And British warships do impress American sailors, so we are being, our sailors are being dragooned. They're being taken off ships, our ships, to fight with the British Navy. James Madison, finally, we've had enough. The U.S. fights the War of 1812 with the impressive win at the end of the war at the Battle of New Orleans, and the Treaty of Ghent restores things to a status quo antebellum. Warhawks argued that war should be declared because they wanted to seize both Indian lands and to seize Canada. James Monroe is the last president who fits the time period here, and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, got very favorable borders for us. The Convention of 1818 gets us a very favorable border with Canada, and the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819 gets us a very, very favorable border with Oregon, and Spain sells us Florida. The Rush-Bagot Treaty, looks like Rush-Bagot, B-A-G-O-T, the Rush-Bagot Treaty demilitarized the Great Lakes, and the Monroe Doctrine told the Europeans to stay out of Latin America, and it reaffirmed our intention to stay out of their business. Question 11, explain ways in which participation in political campaigns and elections between 1815 and 1840, analyze the forces and events that led to these events. Anyhow, let's just go through the blanks here. The Hartford Convention met during the War of 1812, which tagged the Federalist Party with being the party of disloyalty and its electoral demise in ensuing elections. After the war, James Monroe's Democratic Republicans ran the country during the era of good feelings. Remember, Monroe will win all of the electoral votes once the Federalists collapse, with the exception of one symbolic vote against him. But this era does see a rise in sectionalism inflamed by the tariff and the spread of slavery. Henry Clay's American system attempted to balance a tariff with money for internal improvements in the South and in the West. The great compromiser, Henry Clay, also worked to compromise over the entry of Missouri as a slave state in 1820. In 1824, the Democrats cried foul when John Quincy Adams defeated Jackson in what was called a corrupt bargain. This is often called the era of Jacksonian democracy because the franchise expanded for white men, especially with the end of property requirements to vote. Jackson expanded the spoils system, which claimed to stand for the common man, of which he was the first to become president. During Jackson's second term, he vetoed a recharter of the Bank of the United States, which he claimed to be unconstitutional. He also threatened to invade South Carolina, which nullified the national tariff, and this is called the nullification crisis. Those who wanted a national government that would promote national growth through high tariffs, canal, and road building formed the Whig Party. Now, the Whig Party is kind of a Hamiltonian party. Jackson was very proudly called himself a Jeffersonian. He wanted to cut government size, government spending, government taxes. The Whigs saw a place for an active government to promote a bank and high tariffs and canal and road building. And they successfully ran William Henry Harrison in 1840 under the campaign slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And finally, our last question for this unit is question 12. In what ways did developments in transportation bring about economic and social change in the United States in the period 1820 to 1860? Again, we did this similar to an earlier question we just went over, but the AP does repeat questions on economic reform and treaties and things like this. So we'll just go through this one more time. Paved toll roads. The review book says tool roads, typo there, toll roads, also called turnpikes, are being built. The canal building, such as the Erie Canal connecting New York City with this explosive growth in the Midwest. The introduction of clipper ships, these fast-sailing ships. Fulton and Fitch were going to build the first steamboats, which are especially useful in western rivers. They definitely have a commercial purpose in moving passengers around any waterway. Beginning in the 1830s, you have the first railways, which increase the speed of transportation and the volume of transportation while reducing cost. They could operate, obviously, in all seasons. As far as economic change, you have an emergence of an interconnected economy, also called the market revolution, and also called the industrial revolution. Steamboats and canals reduced freight rates, available western land was cheap, and the institution of slavery spreads. Railroads connect the Midwest with the Northeast, and this is going to be very important later on during the Civil War. There's this interconnection of economies all across the Northwest, which would be at this time the Midwest. Cotton is America's #1 export at the time of the Civil War. It's about 2/3 of American exports. And Henry Clay's American system sought to weave regional economies into one national, interdependent, symbiotic relationship, one interdependent economy. As far as social change, urbanization led to the growth of northern cities, brought about a rise in poverty. Nativism grew as steamships brought over immigrants by the boatload from Ireland and Germany, particularly in this period before 1860. Movement west brought arguments over the destiny of slavery, and railroads will make Chicago a Midwestern farm and meat hub and distribution point. So these were all questions. These are questions from the last 15, 20 years or so from this time period. So good studying, good luck, and signing out.